Today we're going to be talking about the lymphatic system and lymphoid organs and tissues. It's chapter 20 of our Marieb's Human Anatomy and Physiology text, and it's going to kind of bridge us from the discussion that we've already had about the cardiovascular system with a discussion of chapter 21, the immune system. So this chapter lays the groundwork for talking about the immune system. The immune system includes a wide variety of different systems and processes in the body. For example, inflammation that we've brought up many times in the past is considered part of the immune response or immune system. But if there's one tissue type that's specialized for the immune system and it's part of the immune system, it's reticular connective tissue. It's part of the loose connective tissue category that we talked about way back in chapter 4. Lymphoid tissue itself is found in many different places in the body, including in the lymphatic system, which we'll start out talking about in this chapter, a series of vessels that carries fluid, as well as in some other organs and tissues throughout the body. So again, the lymphatic system, the way we're going to use that term in this chapter, our discussion is a series of tubes that carries fluid from one place to another, but it just so happens that interspersed among all those tubes is some little mini organs that contain lymphoid tissue. And then we'll be going on to talk about lymphoid tissues and organs throughout the body. So we have lymph nodes within the lymphatic system, but there are other organs such as the spleen, the thymus, and some other sub-organs, tonsils, and other areas, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, for example, where we'll find some reticular connective tissue. So to get started on our topic today, we're talking first about the vessels of the lymphatic system that carry fluid. What fluid? Well, if you think back to part of chapter 19, the cardiovascular system, we talked about the leakiness of blood capillaries. We said that they're quite permeable to, and there's a lot of hydrostatic pressure inside the capillaries, which will force quite a bit of water and small solutes out through the wall of the capillary. That's called capillary filtration. Not diffusion, but bulk flow of water and small solutes, less the proteins, out into the interstitial space. We said quite a bit of that fluid will actually be drawn back into the venous end of the capillaries. So we have this mixing effect between the plasma and the interstitial fluid, and then a small percentage of that filtered fluid, the capillary filtrate, will be lost from this sort of revolving movement of water and small solutes. that filtrate has to be returned to the circulation. We can't allow it to accumulate, and that's the job of the lymphatic system. Once that fluid enters the lymphatic system, it becomes what's called lymph. So here's a little functional schematic diagram of the lymphatic system, and here we see a blood capillary bed. Could represent capillary beds all throughout your entire body. Each one is interspersed with a series of blind-ended capillaries of the lymphatic system. So that makes the lymphatic system very different from the cardiovascular system. It's a one-way system that has a starting point. These capillaries that you see here have an origin, and they're going to collect up the fluid, the filtrate from the blood capillaries, and through a series of vessels, trunks, and ducts, carry it back to the venous circulation. We'll also get a little preview here because we can see some bulges within this duct system or this vessel system, and that's where the lymphoid tissue resides. That's where some immune cells live, as we'll see later on. So about 3 liters per day of fluid is collected up by the lymphatic system and returned to the venous circulation. Here's a little blow up, a magnified graphic of the blind-ended lymphatic capillaries, and the endothelial cells, much like the vascular endothelial cells that make up these capillaries, have openings between the cells, and they have connective tissue fibers, collagen fibers essentially, connecting them to the surrounding extracellular matrix of some connective tissue. And as the fluid begins to accumulate in this tissue, the filtrate, it starts to open up these doors, these trap doors in the lymphatic capillary, and the lymph fluid can flow right into the lymphatic capillary, and thus we can collect up that fluid. So the lymphatic system collects the filtrate, but not just the filtrate from capillaries. During inflammation, for example, there's a lot of extra filtrate. There may be a war zone there. There may be a battle taking place between cells of the immune system and some invaders, some infective cells that are pathogenic, that are disease-causing cells like bacteria that are invading the body. So cell debris, dead or live bacteria or viruses, all kinds of broken down extracellular matrix, protein fibers, all kinds of stuff can wind up in the lymphatic fluid, and it's going to be flowing along through the lymphatic system under these conditions. Cancer cells, as we'll see later, oftentimes cancer cells, when they metastasize, when they leave the site of an original tumor, they may travel in the lymphatic system and sometimes even become trapped in the lymphoid structures within the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic capillaries deliver their fluid, their lymph, into larger vessels and eventually into ducts. But the larger vessels, all these lymphatic vessels, contain valves, so the fluid can only flow in one direction back towards the heart. It's a one-way system as opposed to the cardiovascular system, which is a loop. So there's valves in there to help control the directionality of flow. So trunks are the nearest to the largest ducts. As the lymph vessels coalesce into larger and larger vessels, they eventually form what are called trunks, regional collection tubes, and then into ducts. Two ducts which are going to deliver the fluid into the venous circulation: the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Let's take a look at a graphic that we can see where those things are located. We can see also an asymmetry of the arrangement of the vessels of the lymphatic system. The right side of the lymphatic system collects fluid from the right arm and the right thoracic region and cervical region and head and neck, all into the right lymphatic duct and into the right subclavian vein. We'll show another picture that shows a little bit more of an enlargement. The left side includes fluid collected from all the rest of the body, shown kind of in a pink hue right here, and all that fluid enters into the left subclavian vein by way of the thoracic duct. Thoracic duct is all down here in the thoracic cavity, and then finally terminates here at the left subclavian vein. Just as an aside, lacteals are specialized lymph capillaries, blind-ended capillaries that are found in the intestinal walls. The mucosa of the intestines, there are villi, little finger-like projections in the walls of the intestine to create surface area to capture lots and lots of nutrients that we want to absorb. And within those villi are specialized lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. And they're going to collect all the fats. The fats that are absorbed by the digestive tract enter not directly into the blood, as we'll see in another chapter coming up, but they're going to enter into the lymph fluid, and they're going to form what's called chyle, which is a fatty, milky-like fatty lymph fluid coming from the digestive tract, and it's going to kind of accumulate in this sort of bulbous structure called the cisterna chyli. A cistern, as we've mentioned before, is a word reminiscent of a time when the rainwater of a home would be collected from the roofs down through some pipes down into a holding tank in the basement called a cistern, and that would be the water that would be used for cooking and washing and so forth. So this chamber, the cisterna chyli, collects the lymph fluid from the digestive tract and then combines it with other lymph fluid from the left side of the body up into by way of the thoracic duct into the left subclavian vein. So how does the lymph flow? There's no heart like in the cardiovascular system to push the lymph fluid, and here are some mechanisms or reference to mechanisms by which the lymph fluid can be pushed back towards the heart and eventually into these subclavian veins. Skeletal muscle pumping, just like we talked about with the cardiovascular system, the veins, every time the muscles contract, they compress some of the larger lymph vessels, and the lymph fluid is squeezed out of those vessels, can only go one way because of the valves. Valves prevent the backflow, and the fluid moves towards those subclavian veins. Same thing we talked about with venous circulation. Whenever you inspire air, you create a negative pressure in the thorax to draw in the air by difference in pressure. You draw blood back towards the heart in the great veins. You also draw lymph fluid back towards the thorax and towards the subclavian veins. The larger lymph vessels actually travel along with arteries and veins and nerves and so forth in kind of clusters. Things are organized in that way. Everything's not running willy-nilly through the body. So we have these sort of groupings of structures, and as the ripples travel down the arterial tree, they press against the lymphatic vessels that are located next to them, and that wrings out the fluid. And again, it can only go one way, back towards the thorax and towards the subclavian veins. And finally, the largest lymphatic vessels have smooth muscle in their walls, which waves of contraction called peristalsis can push the lymph fluid along. So we have multiple ways to get this lymph fluid back to the blood. If there's a failure of the lymph fluid to be able to deliver the fluid to some part, from some part of the body back to the blood, we'll have edema formation. And so if it's caused by some failure of the lymphatic system, as opposed to just high blood pressure or inflammation, it's called lymphedema. For example, if we remove a bunch of tissues in an attempt to remove some cancer from the body, we may often remove lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels, and there may be then some accumulation of fluid that would normally have been handled by that part of the lymphatic system. Tumors themselves may block part of the lymphatic system. Eventually, this may be remediated if the lymphatic system is allowed over years of time to regrow. In some cases, the lymphedema may be ameliorated. Lymphangitis is an inflammation within the lymphatic system. You can actually see a red line oftentimes as inflammation moves along the lymphatic system from more distal sites towards more proximal sites, towards the thorax and where the lymph is headed. There may be actually bacteria infecting the lymphatic system, causing inflammation. It causes inflammation of small blood vessels in the walls of the larger lymphatic vessels. If you remember that larger veins and arteries actually have blood vessels within those walls to feed the structures, the cells of those large blood vessel walls, called the vasa vasorum. Well, the vasa vasorum is also found in large lymphatic vessels, and if it becomes inflamed, it makes the lymphatic vessel into a bright red conduit, which can actually be seen on the surface of the body. Lymphoid cells, tissues, and organs. So that's our discussion about the lymphatic system as a plumbing system that carries fluid from all the tissues back into the cardiovascular system. Now we can talk about the immune system tissue now and its location in the body and its function. The cells, first of all, of this lymphoid tissue include lymphocytes, which are immune cells, specialized immune cells of what we call the adaptive immune system. We aren't there yet, so I'm not going to go into a detail about what we mean by the adaptive immune system, but suffice it to say that these are very specialized immune cells, and they have different classifications. T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, or T cells and B cells, which come from the bone marrow, as do all of the white blood cells and red blood cells. And they protect us against antigens. Antigens are foreign substances that come into the body. They're the things that activate an immune response. Anything the immune system perceives as foreign, meaning the immune system attacks it or fights against it, that's called an antigen. So we may be talking about bacteria, viruses, or toxins secreted by bacteria, poisonous chemicals that harm or interfere with cellular processes. Red blood cells that have been inappropriately transfused, that have been now connected or bound by antibodies, cancer cells, foreign cells from a transplant. Anyway, the classifications: T lymphocytes are a class of lymphocyte cells that manage the immune response. We'll have lots of time to talk about that later. They release cytokines, chemicals that talk to other cells in the body to manage the immune response. And they also, another group of the T lymphocytes' job is to surveil or scout out the body to find infected cells. If a virus, for example, gets down inside of a cell, or a bacterium is living inside of cells, it's kind of hidden away. And T lymphocytes have a way of finding out where those infected body cells are and destroying them. It's kind of a risky business, right? We're destroying our own body cells to get at the infection. B lymphocytes are another class of lymphocyte cells that eventually, upon activation, will produce antibodies, defensive proteins that will recognize, and when I say recognize, I mean they stick to, like a lock and key, like you've been taught to think about enzymes and their substrates, will lock onto antigens, and once they lock onto antigens, that will mark them for destruction. Phagocytes will gobble them up by phagocytosis because they recognize those antibodies stuck onto those antigens, and they will destroy them. They're a way of getting antigens out of the body so that they can't do any harm to the body. Other cells of the immune system, lymphoid tissue, macrophages. Macrophages, we've already seen, are patrolling connective tissues, but they're also found in relatively large numbers in lymphoid tissues, the loose reticular connective tissue. They're phagocytic cells that can gobble up anything from live bacteria to debris, dead cells, fragments of cells, connective tissue fibers that have been destroyed and damaged during an immune response or an infection. So these guys are just good at cleaning up the area. They also have this activation of inflammation at their fingertips, as well as T cells. Dendritic cells are another type of phagocytic cell whose job it is to phagocytize foreign substances, especially bacteria that come into the body, and then carry those phagocytized entities to areas where there's lymphoid tissue. They may be in the lymphoid tissue and gobble up something, or they may be in the skin, for example. Langerhans cells in the skin, if they come in contact with a foreign bacterium, for example, that comes into your body through an injury in the skin, they will then leave that area and travel to the nearest location, typically a lymph node, where some lymphocytes are, to start up an immune response. Okay, the supporting cells of the reticular connective tissue are called reticulocytes. The reticular tissue, the structure of it that gives a place for the immune system cells often to live or to travel through, that's called the stroma. And the stroma of reticular tissue is produced by reticulocytes, and that's where the cells can hang on to. They have receptors that can allow them to latch onto those fibers and stay there and do their thing. Lymphoid tissue, so it's a housing. It's that specialized tissue of the immune system, and it provides a place for the immune cells to hang out, provides a vantage point for them to surveil or examine the lymph fluid as it comes through there. As it comes through, the lymph fluid will be purified, filtered, we often say. Macrophages will gobble up all the debris. Dendritic cells will gobble up foreign substances. Both of these cell types will alert and activate lymphocytes so we can get an immune response going. So there's all these cells that kind of hang out in there or that travel through there of the immune system that will protect us from antigens, invading entities, pathogens that enter our body through injuries. And here's a little cartoon of some lymphoid tissue. We can see some reticular fibers that have been produced by the reticulocytes. We can see some lymphocytes, these small spherical white blood cells that are just waiting for their chance to be called upon to defend us against some particular infection. We see some macrophages. Macrophages are kind of these cells with all kinds of long processes emanating from them that are phagocytic cells that again can gobble up and destroy antigens, but also alert the immune system and activate inflammation. Lymphoid tissue can either be diffuse lymphoid tissue, so it's spread out kind of loosely in every organ of the body, at least some of it in every organ, so that there's no place that an invasion could take place in our body without coming in contact with some part of the immune system. For example, under all the mucous membranes, the organ systems that represent the boundaries between the outside and insides of our body, there's some mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, little pockets of lymphoid tissue all under the surface of the mucosa. So there's always some lymphoid tissue in every organ protecting us from possible invasion. There's also some more specialized lymphoid tissue arranged in what are called lymphoid follicles. And so many places where we'll find lymphoid tissue, we'll find these spherical solid follicles comprising many, many lymphocytes packed in kind of an organized way, surrounded by dendritic cells, and providing a location for multiplication or proliferation of lymphocytes if they're called upon to defend us against an infection. The lymphoid organs themselves include two categories: primary lymphoid organs, which are the red bone marrow and thymus. That's where the lymphocytes and white blood cells come from, but particularly the lymphocytes. So that's the origin. We have stem cells and progenitor cells that will give rise to these lymphocytes that will mature in these tissues, and we'll talk more about what we mean in the next chapter about maturing of lymphocytes. And then there's secondary lymphoid organs. The lymphocytes, once they're produced and mature in the bone marrow and in the thymus gland, they spread out throughout the body and enter all the other examples of lymphoid tissue that we've kind of been alluding to up until now. Those are called secondary lymphoid organs. That's where the lymphatic or the white blood cells will live, the immune cells will live and patrol until they're called upon to fight an infection. So here's kind of a nice diagram, the lymphoid man, which will show us where we should be thinking about when we think of the locations of lymphoid tissue in the body. The bone marrow is not really shown here, but the bone marrow and thymus represent the origins, the primary lymphoid tissues. Then we have tonsils in the pharynx, the posterior of the oral cavity and nasal cavity, right? We're bringing in a lot of foreign stuff into the body. We want to surveil it. We want to check it out and activate immune responses as appropriate. The spleen is an important lymphoid organ within the circulatory system. There's mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue throughout the urinary system and the respiratory system and the digestive tract. There's some especially developed malt tissues within the later parts of the small intestine called Peyer's patches. We'll take a look at those briefly in a second. And then the appendix, which is right at the beginning of the large intestine. The small intestine has a connection here to the large intestine. And there's a little sort of segment of a tube-like structure of the large intestine called the appendix with lymphoid follicles. So let's take a look at the lymph nodes as our first candidate, first type of or example of lymphoid tissue in the body. The lymphoid follicles function to filter the lymph. It may be filled with debris from sites of infection and inflammation, as we said, and that will be all purged from the lymph fluid as it travels through a follicle by phagocytosis by macrophages. A lot of immune cells live there, and during the process of the fluid flowing through, antigens that may lurk in that fluid will be exposed to lymphocytes, and they will become activated and initiate an immune response against those antigens. The lymphoid tissues, these lymph nodes, are clustered in particular areas of the body. There are lots and lots of lymph nodes down deep in the connective tissues, but there's also clusters of lymph nodes in certain parts of the body, and they're very familiar to us because they're the very visible sites of maybe cancer cell accumulation or inflammation when we get certain diseases or infections. And so here is another lymphoid man that shows the arrangement of the lymphatic system and clusters of lymph nodes, axillary lymph nodes in the axillary region, cervical lymph nodes in the neck, and inguinal lymph nodes found in this part in the groin. Here is a schematic diagram showing the insides of a lymph node. The lymph node has afferent vessels bringing lymph fluid from upstream, and we're going to collect all that lymph fluid and let it slow down and kind of stagnate a bit as it enters into the lymph node. It's going to percolate through these lymphoid follicles. They're kind of cordoned off from each other by connective tissue boundaries called trabecula. The whole lymph node has an exterior capsule of connective tissue, and these trabecula kind of form little quarantine areas where the fluid can sort of percolate through, slowly moving through an area where there's a lot of lymphocytes. Lymphoid follicles are just solid spherical masses of especially B lymphocytes surrounded by dendritic cells. And so when foreign antigens enter this area, dendritic cells will phagocytize those antigens and immediately start activating lymphocytes that can help us defend against infection. Once that happens, those lymphocytes will begin to multiply here in the germinal center of a follicle, and they'll start taking on their role as a mature immune cell, such as an antibody-producing cell. Or if it's a T lymphocyte, it might go out on the road to start hunting for infected cells of the body. So the fluid percolates through there, then it finally comes down deeper into the lymph node, from the cortex of the lymph node, the outer part, into the medulla of the lymph node, and we have some medullary cords where we see some of the connective tissue fibers in here are sort of decorated by lots of T lymphocytes and macrophages down in here. And then there's some more sort of fibrous structures down in here where the fluid is percolating through, and ultimately these medullary sinuses, lots of macrophages are in there, and finally the fluid exits the lymph node through the efferent vessels on its way to larger lymph vessels and more lymph nodes, and eventually to the thoracic or right lymphatic ducts. And there's just a micrograph showing a section of part of a lymph node. So you can see the follicles with this very dense accumulation of lymphocytes surrounded by surrounding the germinal centers of the follicles, where again lymphocytes that have been activated may be multiplying, proliferating in order to give us a leg up on an immune response. Buboes. You've heard of bubonic plague. What does that term bubonic come from? It's an adjective that is describing bulging, inflamed lymph nodes when you're infected with a particular bacteria. In this case, it was Yersinia pestis that caused bubonic plague. They would cause big inflammatory responses in lymph nodes in these particular dense clusters of lymph nodes, particularly in the inguinal region. But so buboes are these red, swollen, inflamed, bulging lymph nodes. Swollen glands, buboes. We don't usually use that term buboes as much anymore, but just so you know the origin and the use of that term. Lymph nodes can also become the site that cancer cells, metastatic cancer cells, may travel from the site of a tumor, break loose, and wind up in the lymphatic system and become trapped in a lymph node, and they may multiply in that lymph node. Oftentimes white blood cell cancers, whether they arise initially in the bone marrow or if they arise in the lymph nodes themselves, may accumulate a population, a tumor of cells within lymph nodes, and may populate much of the lymphatic system. And so we have enlarged, painless, enlarged, sometimes hardened lymph nodes which contain tumors. Oftentimes, breast cancer cells, for example, may metastasize and enter into the nearby lymphatic vessels and then take up residence in the lymphatic system and form secondary tumors there. The spleen is the largest lymphoid organ, another site of lymphoid tissue. The spleen is sort of centered in the cardiovascular system, is a richly vascular organ that lies in the abdominal cavity, the superior part of the abdominal cavity, just inferior to the diaphragm on the left side of the cavity. And there's a lot of surveillance taking place of any entities which may enter the blood, any viruses, for example, that become systemic. Any bacteria that get into the circulation will be discovered by immune cells in the lymphoid tissue of the spleen. So there's some lymphoid tissue in the spleen whose job it is to act the same way as in lymph nodes to discover and form immune responses against infections and inflammation. Macrophages are in there also, phagocytizing and recycling red blood cells. We discovered this fact way back in chapter 17 when we talked about blood. We saw that there's a recycling process. Red blood cells last for about 4 months. They're removed from the circulation largely by macrophages in the spleen as well as the liver, and then recycled. And we talked about what happens to all the components of hemoglobin when that happens. Also, though, the spleen is a site of storage of red blood cells. We may not have sufficiently emphasized that fact. There's a lot of reserve red blood cells and platelets in the spleen, so that if there's a loss of blood, the spleen can actually contract and release a large number of red blood cells out into the circulation, so that as fluid is fairly quickly replaced, there will be some red blood cells to populate that fluid and maintain a healthy hematocrit. So here's a picture, a little cartoon, again, the lymphatic man showing, a lymphoid man showing where the spleen is located in your body. So the spleen, here's a cartoon of the insides of the spleen. White pulp, the part of the spleen that's the lymphoid tissue that has the immune function, is kind of found surrounding the arteries. The splenic artery branches in the organ, and we see this white pulp. And then there's areas in the spleen where when we looked in the spleen in the micrographs, we saw lots and lots of red blood cells. Purple spots where we saw the stained nuclei of lymphocytes in the white pulp. Lots and lots of red blood cells filled with hemoglobin in the red pulp in other parts of the spleen. So this sort of twofold function and anatomical arrangement of structures within the spleen. Sometimes the spleen may become ruptured by trauma or an infection, and oftentimes that would be an indication for splenectomy. Surgeons would come and remove the damaged spleen, so that there was a fear that the spleen would bleed out into the peritoneum and cause a loss of blood volume, an irreversible process, and that might be a very big problem. Actually, it turns out that the spleen is much more regenerative than it has originally been thought, so the splenectomies aren't quite as common as they used to be. But when there is a splenectomy, there may also be other reasons, maybe cancers, that necessitate removing the spleen. The liver and bone marrow have to kind of take over the functions of the spleen in terms of recycling red blood cells, but also some of the immune function. People that have had a splenectomy are definitely more susceptible to infections, and they have to be more careful about exposing themselves to possible sources of infection. So yes, if you've had a splenectomy, you can live a healthy life and be very active, but you also have to be aware that you are more susceptible to infectious disease. The spleen can actually regenerate in young people. If someone has a splenectomy at a young age, if some of the spleen is left behind, it can actually regenerate and the spleen can take over its normal function in the body. Okay, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, as we've already mentioned, all of the mucous membranes that line organ systems that are essentially exterior to the body have some pockets of lymphoid tissue all along underneath the mucous membrane. Peyer's patches are some very specialized and large region of malt within the later parts of the small intestine, as we'll see in another chapter in the appendix. The tonsils within your pharynx, your throat as we often call it, the sort of cylindrical tubal space behind your posterior to your nasal cavity and your oral cavity, there are tonsils in the walls of the mucosa there of your pharynx, and they're like serrated slots or slits in the wall of that mucous membrane. And along the underneath of those serrations are pockets of lymphoid tissue called tonsils. And they're the first sort of place to get a surveillance of what microorganisms may be coming into your body in the air you inspire, in the food that you consume, and so forth. And so those are very important sites of immune system activation. There's various names for specific subunits of the tonsil system. Let's take a look at a little cartoon that will show us the location of some of these tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsil in the pharynx, the throat, posterior to the nasal cavity. You can see here, there's actually a sort of a ring of tonsil of this lymphoid tissue around the opening of the pharyngeal tympanic tube, so that if anything were to enter, inclined to enter up into that middle ear region. It'll already been checked out by the white blood cells of the immune system in that lymphoid tissue. The lingual tonsil in the posterior of the tongue, on the palatine tonsil, on the soft palate in the throat also. So we have these arrangements of sort of serrations where there's little notches in the surface of the tissue where fluid containing bacteria and viruses can get down in here, and there's lymphoid follicles you can see all along underneath the mucous membrane, underneath the epithelial cells there, so that bacteria and viruses can be translocated across into this tissue and observed and maybe acted upon by the immune system. Again, Peyer's patches and the appendix, so the sites of large clusters of lymphoid follicles. Here's a little schematic diagram showing the later parts of the small intestine, the ileum, where in the wall of the ileum, here's the lumen, the hollow inner part of the intestine tube here, and here are lots and lots of lymphoid follicles in the wall of the ileum called Peyer's patches. So they're just more invested in large lymphoid structures, much like other mucosa-associated lymphoid structures. The spleen also contains lots of lymphoid follicles and a sort of mysterious little organ attached to the large intestine. The thymus, this primary immune organ, is the site of T lymphocyte maturation. We'll save all of our discussion of the thymus gland for the next chapter when we talk about the immune system. So we won't really say much more about it here, other than it's the site of origin of mature T lymphocytes, which can then leave and travel through the body. The thymus gland actually is most active during childhood and up through adolescence, and then begins to atrophy from adolescence on through the rest of life. It'll eventually become less and less active. It still continues to produce immunocompetent or mature T lymphocytes throughout life, but it becomes less and less developed and obvious as time goes on. That's our discussion of the lymphatic system and lymphoid tissues and organs, and that has set the stage for us to discuss and define and examine the immune system in our next chapter. So join me for some episodes of chapter 22, the immune system.